Chapter 12. The ride up to the castle. Zelda loses her cool. Father and son. They bobbed back and forth inside the carriage as it wound its way unsteadily up towards the castle. The horses at the front were clearly spooked, tossing their heads and rolling their eyes uneasily. Inside the carriage, the soldiers crowding beside Link and Russell were just as nervous, casting increasingly frequent glances towards the dark streets outside the carriage. Eventually, one of them stuck his head out the window and shouted, "Look at the sky! You know how dark it is? Can't this thing go any faster?" The driver yelled back, "Shut up! Hard enough keeping these horses under control with a dem monster could be round any dem corner." "It's fine, Nudge," Russell said. "The Nameless has taken a night off." The man looked doubtful, but did not dare to contradict the commandant's word. He settled back into his seat, jostling the cuffs that bound Link's arms. "How do you know that?" Link asked. Russell did not answer him. "What is going to happen to us?" he asked next. Russell still said nothing. "What about Colin? Your own son? What's going to happen to him?" This got to him. The commandant looked at his feet, out the window, at the ceiling, anywhere but meet the eyes of another person in the carriage. I cannot afford to discriminate. My son broke the law. For him to receive anything other than his just punishment, it wouldn't be right. Has it ever occurred to you that maybe you're not the only one who thinks like that?" Russell frowned, not understanding. "How do you mean?" "I mean that Colin is doing what he believes is the right thing, and, despite the fact that he loves you, he's prepared to kill you if he has to." Now he met Link's eyes. "Good." Russell nodded and continued, speaking to himself more than he was speaking to Link. "Good. That's the kind of man I'd want my son to be. You're prepared to let your own son die. I'm proud of him. He stands up for what he believes in. Well, be careful where your pride leads you." The coach rattled to a halt, and the door opened. There were more soldiers waiting for them outside. They stepped outside into the cold night, Link's breath hanging in the air in front of him, this high above the city. Escorted by armed men on either side, Link and Russell walked side by side into the castle. 1,000 tiny points of light hung in the dark sky, framing the gargantuan edifice, the torchlight spilling out of the windows, climbing the walls high above them. The sound of running water from the courtyard's fountains filled his ears. "That's what makes an honorable man," Russell said as they stepped through the polished double doors and into a warm, carpeted atrium. "A man who never compromises his beliefs, even in the face of death. I'd be proud to call such a man my son. And I'd hope that he'd be proud to call me his father." "Sounds more like a stubborn man to me," Link responded, shaking off the gloved hands guiding his shoulders and walking under his own power, his arms still in irons behind his back. "That perhaps I'm stubborn. And what about you, Link? You could die tonight. How will you face your death, when it comes for you?" They walked straight through the atrium, deserted at this time of night, up a spiral flight of stairs, and into a series of long hallways and superfluously luxurious rooms. "Well, we'll find out, won't we?" Russell muttered. "Nobody needs to die," Link responded, finally. "This isn't worth dying for, Russell, and it isn't worth losing your son." Russell contemplated this for a moment. "You're young." "What's that got to do with it?" "Because you don't realize that every man has something he's willing to die for, and something he's willing to kill for. Sometimes, they're one and the same, but other times..." They at last walked into a room with no entrances or exits save the door behind them. The high ceiling was decorated with ancient frescoes depicting the city of Hyrule, and statues of the gods and goddesses lined the walls. The royal crest hung high on the far wall, near the ceiling, carved entirely out of gold, and beneath it was a raised dais and an ornate throne. The throne was empty, at the moment. "The other times, those two things are different.
And that's when it becomes important to find out which of those two causes a man holds most dear.
On the floor in the center of the room were 3 circles that seemed to be made out of light. Each was as wide as a fully grown man's arm span, and comprised of a series of complex runes and words in a language he could not read. They were clearly rife with a powerful magic. Link thought that he could hear the humming of the spells as they approached.
"Stand in the circle, if you please,"
Russell said,
"the middle one."
He looked back. The commandant shoved him forward. Link sighed in resignation, and stepped into the glowing runes. As soon as he set foot in the circle, it felt as if an enormous weight had been placed on his shoulders and, at the same time, there was another wrapped around his legs, dragging him to the ground. He could not stand. Sinking to his knees, the weight lessened ever so slightly, but when he tried to escape the runes, it grew once more until he could not move.
"It's a binding circle,"
said a voice. There was a woman in the circle to his left. Tall, shapely, and pale, with fiery red hair, she knelt as well, bound by the magic. Dried blood crusted her face underneath her nose and around her mouth, and the way she clutched at her abdomen hinted at a wound there, as well.
Powerful magic,"
she said tiredly.
"It saps your strength unless you give in to its pull. Not exactly a prison, but keeps hooligans like us under control, eh?" "I'm sorry."
Link looked her over. At first he thought she was naked, but then it became apparent that she was clothed in what seemed to be the shadows themselves.
"But have we met?"
The woman laughed uproariously, or at least as uproariously as she could given the circumstances.
"You're a little bit slow, aren't you? Eehee. Not your fault, I guess. But it sure is humbling to know that your most memorable feature is a silly hat."
His eyes widened in realization.
No. Midna."
She nodded.
"But you're 7 feet tall?"
she asked.
"Oh, it's not so bad. You can just be on top if it intimidates you that much."
It was Midna, all right.
"What? What happened to you?"
She jerked her head towards the far wall. Following her vitriolic gesture, he spotted a small purple child leaning morosely against the wall, and beside him, an extremely tall and skinny man in black robes, his face hidden by an enormous pointed helm.
"Vadi and Zant,"
Midna spat.
"Zelda's 2 viziers. They ambushed me." "Yeah, I got jumped, too. I was actually asking how come you're not an imp thing anymore. I'll tell you if we ever get out of this goddamned mess alive."
She jerked her head again to indicate Russell standing behind them, eavesdropping on their conversation. More guards entered the room, escorting the defiant pair or Colin and Ashe. They were made to kneel next to Midna, although no binding circles had been traced on the ground for them. Out of the corner of his eye, Link also noticed that they were unbound.
"The circles are only for big shots like us, I guess,"
Midna whispered.
"Want to put money on who that last one is for?"
The 4 of them knelt silently, staring straight ahead, not making eye contact with any of their captors. Everybody in the room began to fidget restlessly as more and more time passed, nearly 2 hours, and still nobody spoke. They all knew who they were waiting for. It was deep into the night when at last the doors to the throne room opened one more time. Ganondorf walked in wordlessly and complacently took his spot in the circle beside Link, grunting slightly as the magic took effect and hauled him to his knees. He saw Vissen enter, as well, but to his great surprise, the old man did not take a position along the kneeling line of prisoners. Instead, he stood quietly behind them, just beside Russell. Link turned and looked at him. Vissen looked away. The last person to enter the room was Princess Zelda herself, walking calmly to take her place standing triumphantly in front of the defeated Gerudo. The metal plates of her armor shone brightly in the magically augmented torchlight, her ornate rapier very real and very menacing strapped at her side.
"Is this all of them?"
she asked. There was a moment's hesitation, and then it was Vissen who answered her.
"All but one. There's a fairy, Navi, she must have escaped."
Colin, surprisingly, was the first to speak up, his voice almost unrecognizable for the amount of hate that it held.
"You coward!
he began glaring at Vissen, but Zelda with a raised hand cut him off.
Shh,
she hushed him.
Be quiet. Can't you feel it?
Colin was, understandably, confused. Link saw similar puzzled looks from Midna, as well as several of the guards in the room. But he understood perfectly. He felt it. There was something, deep within him, that felt right here. It scared him. It felt that, even if the spell restraining him was to fall away, if the soldiers with all their weapons were to part, and the doors to open, he still would not escape. He wouldn't want to. He belonged here. With Zelda, and with Ganondorf. His partners in this sacred bond. No. More than that. His siblings. It was only when his vision blurred slightly that Link realized that he was crying, tears springing unbidden to his eyes. Zelda, too, was weeping, eyes and the pale, flawless skin of her face shining with moisture. He looked next to him and saw that Ganondorf, as well, moisture wound its way down that imposing, weather-beaten face. It went without saying that this was a very unusual sight. He heard Midna and Ashe gasp audibly, and several of the guards exchanged worried looks. Russell hurried forward to Zelda's side.
Princess! Is everything all right? Leave me be, Russell,
she said, and he withdrew slightly, but did not retake his place behind the prisoners. Zelda stepped forward and knelt, so that she was at eye level with the two other bearers.
You feel it,
she said insistently,
tell me you feel it.
I do, Link whispered.
Zelda,
Ganondorf began.
Such power,
she marveled aloud.
Goddesses, I have never felt such, no. Why invoke their name in wonder, when we rival even them? The three of us, on a whim, could destroy Hyrule and begin anew.
A chill ran down Link's spine, because he believed that Zelda might actually try it.
Zelda, that is precisely why this power has been divided between three of us, and not placed in the hands one lost little princess.
This seemed to snap her out of her reverie. She stood, and stepped back, so that she was once standing imperiously over them.
You are a fool, Ganondorf. A sad and pathetic excuse for a king, substituting this little band of insurgents for your lost nation of savages. I am not the king of my insurgents, Zelda. I am their comrade.
The way Ganondorf was speaking hinted that this was perhaps not the first time he had had this particular conversation. She laughed coldly.
We could have such power. The three of us could rule Hyrule, no kings or queens, but gods. We have so much power at our disposal, and you're willing to throw it away.
Ganondorf looked down at his hand.
Power is not what you're looking for, Zelda. Oh. Then what am I looking for? I don't know. And I think that it's very likely you don't either. Is anybody paying any attention to us?
Midna asked.
At all.
Link was growing increasingly wary as the conversation continued. When he had met Zelda, days ago in the Royal Library, she had seemed cold and aloof, almost incapable of showing emotion. But the Zelda that he saw here was growing increasingly heated, and was most definitely emotional. She turned to him, now.
Link. You needn't have anything to do with this has-been and his delusions of a rebellion. You know what really matters, what's really important. What binds us together. I think,
he said, very slowly,
that you and I have very different ideas of what's important.
Zelda shook her head insistently, sweeping a hand across the room.
All of this, Link, Hyrule, the people, the world itself, all of it will die someday. Only we are immortal. As long as the power of the gods lives on, so do we. I'm sorry, Princess,
Link said as respectfully as he could, trying in vain to defuse the tension in the room,
but I'm not interested in power. If I can live my life knowing that the people who live here are free to live theirs as well, then I'll be happy.
This only served to make her angrier.
So you would just ignore this gift you've been given? You have the ability to do so much, and you would cast that aside and live like a peasant? I don't think that either of us have the right to wield such power, Princess. Then you are being irresponsible. Why else would we have been granted the Triforce, if we are not to use it? We are meant to rule over the people. It is our destiny. Do not fool yourself into thinking that you are immortal,
Ganondorf said quietly. Zelda ignored him, but her next statement had the definite sound of an ultimatum.
This power was given to us for a reason, Link, and I know that they meant for us to ascend to godhood and join our creators. I don't think that entails us casting aside the people who we're supposed to be protecting.
Her flawless features suddenly twisted themselves into an approximation of rage, and Zelda stood.
You are both unworthy and ungrateful for the power the gods have granted you. Both of you. You don't understand, Zelda.
Ganondorf tried to reason with her one last time.
This search for meaning is pointless. Look at where it's led you. You were a benevolent ruler once, long ago. The traitors Ganondorf and Link will be executed at dawn,
she said dismissively,
for the crimes of high treason and blasphemy against our goddesses. You're a fool, Zelda.
He shouted at her, straining against the magical bonds that held him.
What is this pathetic excuse for wisdom? Nothing. You know nothing. You are.
She turned and slapped him across the face, hard enough to draw blood when the gauntlet smashed against the bridge of his nose. The next thing that happened did occur very quickly, much too fast to anticipate and nearly too fast to react to. But Link saw the whole thing from start to finish, and had he not been bound, he could have stopped it well before it played out, had he desired. It was over the span of 3 seconds. There was one other person who was in a position to prevent what happened next. Russell stood beside and behind the princess, armed and able to move freely. Link knew that his reflexes were easily as well honed as his own, and probably more so, and on top of that even saw Russell's eyes follow the sequence of events from its beginning until its conclusion. The commandant did not even draw his sword. It was as if it did not even occur to him to do so, that his mind simply could not process the concept of taking the necessary action. What happened was this: Colin proved himself to be both Russell's son and a truly loyal member of the Gerudo. Not that Colin was anywhere near skillful enough that what he did would succeed 9 times out of 10, or even 99 times out of 100. His ability as a warrior did have quite a bit to do with it, but the fact of the matter is that in the next 3 seconds everything aligned itself perfectly for him, and Colin hit upon what was easily the quickest and most fortuitous streak of luck in his entire life. Vissen, from his place behind the line of prisoners and between Colin and Midna, cried aloud in pain and began to fall. Somewhere on his person, Colin had secreted a knife, most likely in his shoe or the crook of his arm, somewhere that had no doubt managed to luckily escape what must have been a hasty and incomplete search. He knew that even a single motion to look backwards would have given him away, so he struck blind, and just happened to get lucky yet again. Without looking to pick his target, he stabbed Vissen in the thigh, hitting him just above the knee, and slashed outwards, ripping apart tendons and crippling his former comrade. As Vissen fell, Colin snatched the sword at Vissen's waist and drew it as he leapt to his feet and took 3 quick steps. Zelda at this time had just completed the act of striking Ganondorf in the face with no small amount of force, momentum that carried her whole body along with it. She had stepped into the strike and was now committed to the follow-through. This, of course, prevented her from reacting as quickly as she might have to the charging Colin. Out of the corner of her eye she must have seen him, though, because she turned and reached for her own weapon, although by that point it was already too late. Had the assailant been anybody else, they would not have even made it halfway across the floor to where Zelda was. Russell, with his deadly reflexes, would have struck them down in an instant. But this was his son. Russell hesitated. Colin took those 3 steps past his gaping father and, on the 3rd step, launched himself high into the air with Vissen's sword raised in both hands above his head. The Princess Zelda had turned to face him as she made the motion to draw her rapier, which meant that as he came down the point of the blade struck her high in the chest, in a spot above and just to the side of her left breast. As it happened, the gap in her armor that exposed itself as she turned and reached towards her waist happened to coincide with the spot where Colin's sword struck. The force created by the forward and downwards momentum of his body acted naturally to drive the blade in his hands forward and downwards, so that the point of the blade reappeared once more just below Zelda's shoulder blades and just above the small of her back. Colin ran Zelda through with the sword, and this was where his miraculous streak of luck ended. Several of the soldiers cried aloud at this, and there were a few loud exclamations of "No! From where they had been observing the proceedings at the far end of the throne room, Zant and Vadi immediately rushed forward. Link heard loud, shocked gasps from both Ashe and Midna, and thought that even Ganondorf had allowed a startled exhortation. But the Gerudo leader leapt into action faster than anybody, giving an almighty roar of effort and throwing himself to the side. The magic circle crackled, and for an instant Link saw a visible wall of energy straining against Ganondorf's efforts, but then the wall shattered, the circle broke and vanished, and Ganondorf launched himself through the air and right into Link. He hit Link hard, crashing into him and sending them both flying. For an instant it felt as if he had been thrown into a wall that not only became harder the more you pushed at it, but also pushed back, but then the wall broke and Link was free, as well. Colin and Zelda simply stood where they were, frozen in shock. Neither seemed to be able to process what had just happened, Zelda in desperate denial, and Colin unable to believe that his suicidal venture had actually succeeded. It was in that instant that Russell realized what he had done, or rather, what he had allowed to be done through his inability to stop his own son. Overwhelmed with guilt, and rage, and despair, and confusion, Russell acted without thinking, his soldier's training taking hold and carrying out the action in a vain attempt to redeem himself for his moment of hesitation. The commandant's sword moved in a blur of steel and reflected torchlight, and his son crumbled.
"Colin!"
Link bellowed.
"Impossible,"
Ganondorf breathed next to him. He was not talking about what had happened to Colin. Zelda had taken 2 unwitting steps back from where Colin lay on the floor, almost certainly dead. Her face was not fixed in the slack, unfocused gaze of the dead or dying, but rather held an expression of shock and extreme indignation, as if she was unbelieving of the fact that someone had dared to stab her. But the most telling fact that all was not quite right was that the wound was entirely bloodless. Nothing stained her armor or dripped down the blade of the sword, it was one clean puncture, almost like if the sword had been run through a scarecrow instead of a human being.
"That's impossible,"
Ganondorf said again.
"How has she done this?"
Zelda, with a visible display of effort, reached up and laid her hand on the blade that pierced her chest, working some sort of magic on it. It glowed for an instant, and then vanished into nothingness, leaving the princess to fall momentarily to her knees before struggling again to her feet with fire in her eyes.
"That is bad,"
said Ganondorf.
"Guys, give me a hand here,"
Midna shouted, unable to overpower the binding circle.
"Get me out of this thing."
Link and Ganondorf each seized an arm and pulled, and, with a swear of pain, Midna was yanked free. For some reason Link had thought she would return to her usual diminutive appearance when she came free of the circle, but she remained taller than he was.
"We gotta get out of here,"
she said. A bolt of what appeared to be lightning flew at her face, and Midna barely managed to deflect the magic before retorting with a strike of her own. Zant and Vadi hurled sparking death at them with a savage desperation, and Midna and Ganondorf were suddenly locked in combat, barely able to keep pace. Link turned and saw that the guards, weapons drawn, were advancing on them from all directions. They were surrounded.
"My sword!"
he yelled.
"Where's my sword?" "We need to go,"
Midna repeated, directing waves of fire towards the 2 viziers.
"We need to go right now."
Ashe tackled the soldier nearest her and dragged him to the ground. After a brief struggle, she seized hold of his weapon and stabbed him twice. He lay still.
"Clear a path to the exit,"
Ganondorf yelled.
"We need to run."
Zelda had regained her balance. A golden light had begun to shine over the hole in her chest, and she seemed to stagger slightly as she drew her rapier and began to weave magic of her own.
"We need to run, now,"
Ganondorf bellowed, again. The path to the exit was blocked by the advancing men. Link saw more soldiers running to cut them off, as the circle around the 4 of them tightened and the gaps disappeared. Only one person was unaffected by the chaos. Russell's mind had finally caught up to his well-trained hands, and had processed what that had done. The commandant sank to his knees and, oblivious to the fighting, bent over the spot where his son lay motionless on the ground, wrapping his arms around the boy and clutching Colin's lifeless form to his chest. Chapter end.